When you try to empathize with a narcissist, you're stepping into one of the most dangerous psychological traps ever studied, and most people don't even realize it until it's too late. According to a study from the University of Georgia, over 6% of the population shows strong narcissistic traits. But here's the terrifying part. Nearly 80% of their victims are described as highly empathetic or emotionally intelligent. That means the people most capable of understanding others are also the ones most likely to be destroyed by them. They don't break you by shouting or hurting you directly. They do it by twisting your empathy into guilt, by making you doubt your own reality, by feeding off your compassion until you no longer recognize yourself. And science proves it. MRI studies show that empathic people's brains literally light up in pain when they see others suffer. Narcissists see that sensitivity as a map, and they use it to control, manipulate, and drain you until all that's left is silence. So, what really happens when you try to empathize with a narcissist? Why do the kindest, smartest, and most self-aware people fall into their trap again and again? And more importantly, how do you break free without losing the part of you that still wants to believe in good? Before we dive in, do me one favor. Hit like on this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this. Because what you'll learn next might not just open your eyes, it might protect your peace forever. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But when one of those substances is a narcissist, the reaction is toxic, slow, and almost invisible." People often think that narcissists only manipulate the weak or naive. Yet studies from Harvard and the University of British Columbia show the opposite. Narcissists often target intelligent, kind, and emotionally aware individuals. Why? Because empathy is not a weakness, it's a currency, and narcissists know exactly how to spend it. Think of famous minds like Freud or Nietzsche. Both warned about the seduction of intellect and ego. Freud described narcissism as a defense mechanism built to protect fragile self-esteem. Nietzsche went further, calling it a sickness of the spirit disguised as superiority. And here lies the trap. Narcissists don't want your stupidity. They want your depth. The deeper you are, the more they can mirror, absorb, and feed on your emotional intelligence. Imagine you meet someone who seems to understand you instantly. They mirror your emotions, your humor, your dreams. It feels magnetic, almost spiritual. This is what psychologists call love bombing, and it activates the same dopamine and oxytocin pathways as falling in love. Empaths interpret this intensity as connection, but for narcissists, it's strategy. They study you, mimic you, and make you feel seen, not because they care, but because they're collecting emotional data. Jung called this the shadow dance, when one person unknowingly feeds the darkness of another under the illusion of light. Neuroscientists discovered that people with higher empathy scores also show more activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional pain. It means empathetic people literally feel others' emotions as if they were their own. When you try to understand a narcissist, you don't just imagine their pain, you internalize it. You start to believe that if you could love them more, they would heal. That's the illusion. You can't love someone's trauma out of them, especially when they use it as a weapon. Eckhart Tolle once said that the ego feeds on conflict, comparison, and drama. Narcissists create emotional storms because that's how they stay alive. They need attention like oxygen. And when you empathize, when you say maybe they're just hurt, you unknowingly give them exactly what they crave: validation and energy. Your understanding becomes their fuel. What's fascinating and tragic is that this dynamic mirrors ancient philosophical warnings. Socrates taught that self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, but empathy without boundaries destroys that self-knowledge. You start to question your own reality. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe it's my fault. That's the beginning of gaslighting. Psychologists describe it as a slow erosion of your perception of truth until you depend entirely on the manipulator's version of reality. Real-world examples prove how intelligent people can fall into this pattern. Therapists, teachers, doctors, professions built on compassion, are statistically more likely to be targeted by narcissists They have what the narcissist lacks: warmth, patience, emotional nuance. And narcissists see that as a resource to exploit. It's not attraction, it's extraction. The paradox is cruel. The more you try to understand them, the more you disconnect from yourself. You rationalize their behavior through empathy. They had a hard childhood, they're under stress, they'll change. Freud called this transference, the projection of your own emotional logic onto someone who operates on none. You give meaning to their chaos, hoping your love will anchor them, but you can't heal someone who benefits from being broken. The truth is, narcissists don't choose you because you're weak. They choose you because you shine. They need your empathy to feel alive. They need your stability to appear sane. They need your validation to maintain their illusion. And that's why the smartest, most self-aware people often stay the longest. They mistake endurance for loyalty. Empathy becomes the golden chain that binds you. It feels moral, even noble, to keep understanding them. You believe compassion will end the conflict. But philosophy and psychology both warn us. Misplaced compassion is self-betrayal. Descartes spoke of doubt as the first act of reason. The moment you start doubting your own intuition, because someone convinced you that your feelings are wrong, you've already stepped into the narcissist's labyrinth. Here's the brutal clarity that few are ready to hear. The narcissist doesn't fear losing you. They fear losing control over you. And every act of empathy, every attempt to fix things, tightens their grip. Understanding this isn't cynicism, it's liberation. Because once you see that empathy without discernment is manipulation's playground, you begin to reclaim your strength. So why do smart people fall for narcissists? Because intelligence doesn't protect you from emotion. Because your mind might see the red flags, but your heart wants to believe in the good you once saw. That's the trap. The moment empathy turns into self-erasure. But awareness, as Jung said, is the first step toward transformation. The more you see through the illusion, the less power it holds. And what was once a trap becomes a lesson in emotional mastery, a doorway to true wisdom, not through their chaos but through your awakening. Freud once wrote that the ego is not master in its own house. That insight becomes terrifyingly clear when you understand how narcissists use your own psychology against you. They don't conquer by force, they conquer by reflection. Carl Jung called it the mirror effect, when someone reflects your best traits back to you so precisely that you mistake imitation for intimacy. Narcissists are master illusionists of the psyche. They observe what makes you feel seen, admired, validated, and then they construct a perfect version of that. You think you've found a soulmate, but you've actually met a projection of yourself. This is how the manipulation begins. It's not through lies, at least not immediately. It's through resonance. You see yourself in them, your humor, your interests, your values. They seem to understand your emotional language better than anyone ever has. But what's really happening is psychological mimicry. Neuroscience calls it limbic resonance, the brain's way of syncing emotionally with others. In healthy relationships, this builds connection. In narcissistic dynamics, it becomes a weapon. Because when your emotions start to mirror theirs, they gain control of your inner world without you noticing. Nietzsche once warned that whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. That's precisely what happens in the mirror game. The narcissist reflects your empathy, your kindness, even your pain, until you start behaving like them, defensive, reactive, anxious. You lose your moral center trying to decode theirs, and while you're busy analyzing their feelings, they're analyzing your weaknesses. One of the most dangerous tactics narcissists use is selective empathy. They know how to show just enough compassion to keep you hooked. Research from the Journal of Personality Disorders shows that narcissists can mimic empathy cognitively. They can describe emotions accurately, but they don't feel them. It's like emotional acting. That's why their apologies sound perfect but never change behavior. They've learned the language of remorse, not its reality. Take the example of a public figure like Ted Bundy, not for his crimes but for his psychology. Even FBI profilers noted that he was extraordinarily charming, articulate, and emotionally aware. He knew how to mirror vulnerability to gain trust. He didn't manipulate through fear but through familiarity. This is the chilling truth about narcissists. They make you believe you're special by pretending they're the only ones who truly understand you. Socrates believed that ignorance is the root of evil. In narcissistic dynamics, that ignorance is emotional. You assume everyone feels the way you do. You believe empathy is universal. But the narcissist doesn't experience empathy as connection. They experience it as information. Each time you open up, you're giving them data points, your insecurities, your dreams, your triggers. Later, those same confessions will be turned into weapons during conflict. It's emotional espionage disguised as intimacy. And here's where philosophy meets psychology. Descartes argued that perception is not truth, it's interpretation. Narcissists distort that interpretation. They mix compliments with subtle criticisms. I love how you care so much, even if it makes you a bit naive. This technique, known as intermittent reinforcement, keeps your brain oscillating between reward and doubt. Studies in behavioral psychology show that this pattern releases dopamine in unpredictable intervals, the same mechanism behind addiction. You start craving their approval, mistaking volatility for passion. Jung wrote that the narcissist lives entirely within their persona, the mask they present to the world, while their real self remains undeveloped, hollow. But to sustain that mask, they need constant reflection from others. That's why narcissists don't love people, they love attention, they love mirrors. When you stop reflecting admiration, they punish you, often through withdrawal, silent treatment, or humiliation. It's not about disagreement, it's about control of the narrative. Eckhart Tolle explained that the ego's greatest fear is annihilation, and its greatest desire is validation. The narcissist lives in that paradox permanently. They crave worship because, without it, they feel invisible. They manipulate emotions not out of malice alone, but out of desperation. The inner void must be fed. When you empathize with that void, you become its food source. You start carrying emotions that were never yours, defending behaviors that should never be excused. What makes it even more insidious is that their manipulation doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks like care. They might say, "I'm only hard on you because I see your potential." It sounds nurturing, but it's domination wrapped in encouragement. Over time, you begin to question your own instincts. You stop trusting your perception, which is exactly the goal. Freud called this the reversal of reality principle, when emotional dependence replaces rational thought. Here's what few understand. Narcissists don't destroy people by attacking their weaknesses. They destroy them by exploiting their strengths: empathy, patience, forgiveness, hope. They don't need to convince you they're good. They only need to convince you that you can save them. That's the mirror's final illusion. And the moment you try to save them, you lose yourself in the reflection. The lesson isn't to stop empathizing, it's to empathize wisely. To understand that love without discernment becomes servitude. Jung said that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. Narcissists thrive in that unconscious space, the fog of confusion, compassion, and hope. Seeing through the mask doesn't make you cold, it makes you awake. Because empathy, when guided by awareness, is no longer a trap. It becomes clarity, and clarity is the one thing a narcissist cannot imitate. It begins quietly. One day you're explaining yourself for the 5th time, wondering how a simple conversation turned into a storm of guilt, confusion, and exhaustion. You replay the argument in your head, searching for the moment it shifted, when caring turned into chaos. This is the invisible war between compassion and self-respect, the battlefield where empaths lose themselves, trying to understand someone who thrives on misunderstanding. Carl Jung once said that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But the pain that comes from loving a narcissist isn't just emotional, it's existential. It shakes your sense of identity. You begin to wonder who you are when you're not trying to fix them. Psychology calls this enmeshment, a fusion of identities where your emotions become dependent on another person's moods. It's why you feel relief when they're happy, anxiety when they're silent, and guilt when you try to pull away. You stop existing as a separate individual and start living as a reflection of their approval. Neuroscientific studies have shown that emotional rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. That's why walking on eggshells around a narcissist feels like surviving a battlefield. Your nervous system is constantly alert. Over time, this hypervigilance becomes normalized. You learn to anticipate their anger before it arrives, to decode their tone before they speak. It's not love anymore, it's survival dressed as empathy. Sigmund Freud described this process as repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to relive emotional trauma in an attempt to resolve it. Many empaths, often without realizing it, are replaying old emotional scripts. They were the children who learned to earn love by understanding chaos. They grew up reading emotional weather like forecasts, adjusting their behavior to keep the peace. When a narcissist enters their life, that pattern feels familiar. The unpredictability doesn't alarm them, it feels like home. Eckhart Tolle would call this the pain body, the emotional residue of past suffering that feeds on new drama to sustain itself. The narcissist triggers that pain body perfectly. Each insult, each withdrawal, awakens your oldest wounds: abandonment, rejection, unworthiness. You keep trying to heal those wounds through the very person who keeps reopening them. It's a psychological paradox. Your empathy becomes the instrument of your suffering. The confusion deepens when compassion starts to look like weakness. Nietzsche once said that whoever despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. The narcissist uses that exact logic. They make you feel guilty for defending your boundaries. You start apologizing for having needs. When you express hurt, they accuse you of being dramatic. When you stay quiet, they call you cold. It's a no-win situation, and the mind begins to fragment under the weight of cognitive dissonance. You know something is wrong, yet you keep rationalizing it. Because the alternative, accepting that they never loved you the way you loved them, feels unbearable. What few realize is that narcissists create cycles of idealization and devaluation not by accident, but by instinct. It's the push and pull that keeps you emotionally addicted. Behavioral psychologists have compared it to slot machines. Unpredictable rewards create the strongest attachments. You never know when they'll be kind again, and that uncertainty releases dopamine each time they are. It's not love you're chasing anymore. It's relief. And relief is the most powerful drug the brain knows. Descartes taught that the first step to truth is doubt. Yet, when you start doubting a narcissist, they twist that doubt back onto you. They'll say, "You're imagining things," or "You're overthinking again." Slowly, they replace your intuition with their narrative. That's why victims of narcissistic abuse often say, "I don't trust myself anymore." It's not a figure of speech. It's a neurological rewiring. Your inner compass has been magnetized toward their approval. Real-world data supports this. Studies by the American Psychological Association show that people who endure narcissistic relationships often develop symptoms similar to PTSD, nightmares, hyper-alertness, emotional numbing. But unlike physical abuse, the wounds are invisible. There are no bruises to point at, no proof to show. Just confusion, isolation, shame. The world sees you as strong and intelligent, yet inside you feel hollow, disconnected, unsure of where empathy ends and self-betrayal begins. Socrates once said, "To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom." Yet when you love a narcissist, knowing yourself becomes the hardest task. Your mind is hijacked by their inconsistencies. One day they tell you you're their soulmate. The next they withdraw affection with surgical precision. Each high feels sacred. Each low feels like death. You start measuring your worth by their mood swings. And yet, there's something sacred hidden in this chaos. Jung believed that every crisis of the soul carries within it the seed of transformation. When your compassion collides with your self-respect, you're forced to choose, to keep understanding them or to start understanding yourself. The moment you realize that empathy without boundaries is not love, but self-erasure, something shifts. The silence that once felt like punishment starts to feel like freedom. It's here in this fragile awareness that healing begins. When you start observing your own reactions without judgment, the racing heart, the guilt, the constant need to explain, you take your first step out of their psychological maze. You begin to see that love and suffering are not the same thing, that you don't need to destroy yourself to prove your compassion. And that true empathy, as both Jung and Tolle would agree, begins not with understanding others, but with remembering yourself. There's a reason why Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca spoke of inner fortitude as the highest virtue. They lived in a world of chaos, manipulation, and ego, much like ours, and yet they believed that serenity was not granted by peace around you, but by mastery within you. When you've been entangled with a narcissist, this truth hits differently. You realize that boundaries are not walls, they are the architecture of sanity. Descartes once declared, "I think, therefore I am." But when you've been psychologically drained by someone who thrives on emotional control, it becomes more like, "I doubt, therefore I disappear." Narcissists are experts at erasing your ability to think independently. They rewrite the script of your reality. Setting boundaries isn't just emotional hygiene, it's philosophical rebellion. It's reclaiming the right to define what exists inside your mind. Nietzsche believed that strength is born from self-overcoming. In this context, boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acts of evolution. They require you to confront your guilt, your fear of rejection, your addiction to approval. The narcissist's greatest weapon is your discomfort with saying no. They thrive on your inability to tolerate disapproval, but once you stop seeking their validation, their entire structure collapses. Because, as Freud observed, narcissists depend on external affirmation to regulate their self-esteem. Without your emotional feedback, they fall into their own emptiness. Philosophers understood this centuries before psychology had words for it. Socrates taught that wisdom begins with recognizing one's ignorance. In emotional terms, that means admitting that you cannot change someone who doesn't want to evolve. You can only change your participation in their chaos. The moment you internalize that, your power shifts. The narcissist no longer feels omnipotent because you're no longer in their psychological arena. You've moved from reaction to observation. This shift mirrors what cognitive behavioral therapy later proved scientifically. When you detach from reactive emotional loops, your prefrontal cortex and the rational part of the brain reactivates. You think clearly again. You stop catastrophizing. You see patterns instead of excuses. Boundaries, therefore, are not just emotional tools. They are neurological resets. They turn chaos into clarity. Eckhart Tolle described boundaries as a form of presence. He said, "True power is living as the stillness beneath the noise." The narcissist wants you reactive, impulsive, explaining yourself endlessly. Because the more you react, the more you're controlled. Boundaries cut the energetic cord. They stop you from feeding the drama. Silence becomes strategy, not surrender. There's an ancient Stoic principle called apatheia, often misunderstood as apathy. It doesn't mean indifference. It means mastery over emotional disturbance. Epictetus taught that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. When you apply that to narcissistic dynamics, it becomes revolutionary. The narcissist can provoke, distort, or withdraw, but your response remains anchored. You don't rise to the bait. You watch without absorbing. That's emotional alchemy, turning pain into power. Science backs this philosophy. Studies in emotional regulation show that when individuals practice self-distancing, imagining a situation as if advising a friend, the intensity of emotional pain decreases dramatically. This method activates analytical thought over emotional reactivity. It's what Descartes meant when he urged humans to separate thought from impulse. Philosophy and psychology converge here. Awareness creates distance, and distance creates freedom. But boundaries are not just intellectual, and they must be embodied. You feel them in your posture, your tone, your breathing. You stop apologizing for taking space. You stop explaining your worth. Nietzsche wrote that freedom is the will to be responsible to ourselves. That's what boundaries really are, responsibility for your own peace. It's not punishment, it's preservation. In real life, this looks less dramatic than it sounds. It's the pause before replying to a text meant to provoke. It's the calm no delivered without anger. It's choosing not to justify yourself when accused of being cold or selfish. Narcissists interpret boundaries as rejection because in their world, love equals control. But to you, boundaries are liberation. The moment you step out of their psychological narrative and back into your own story. Carl Jung said that individuation, The process of becoming your true self begins the moment you withdraw your projections. You stop seeing others as saviors or villains and start recognizing your own reflection in every dynamic. Boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're about ending the illusion that you owe your soul to someone else's wounds. In the end, the philosophy of boundaries is not just self-defense, it's enlightenment. It's the realization that your compassion must serve truth, not illusion. That love is not proven through suffering, but through self-respect. And that inner peace isn't given by the absence of narcissists. It's earned through the presence of discernment. When you understand this, everything changes. You no longer fight for their approval. You cultivate your own peace. You stop chasing closure and start embodying it. You begin to see that the greatest act of empathy is sometimes walking away, not in anger, but in quiet strength. Because every step you take toward your own boundaries is a step away from their control, and a step closer to the person you were always meant to become. There comes a point when confusion turns into clarity, not because the narcissist changes, but because you do. What once felt like chaos begins to reveal patterns. What once felt like love now reads like manipulation. And for the first time, you stop asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and begin asking, "What is this teaching me about myself?" That question marks the beginning of awakening, not spiritual escapism, but psychological rebirth. Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've ignored or denied. In a strange and painful way, narcissists become mirrors of that shadow. They expose our need for validation, our fear of abandonment, our tendency to give without limit. They hold up a distorted reflection of everything we haven't healed. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The narcissist then becomes an uninvited teacher. Brutal, yes, but necessary. They show us where we've abandoned ourselves long before they ever did. Freud observed that every human carries within them an ancient conflict between the id, instinct and desire, and the superego, morality and control. The narcissist lives entirely in the id, seeking pleasure, dominance, admiration. But the empath often lives trapped in the superego, over-regulating, over-giving, over-forgiving. The awakening comes when you realize that healing requires balance, reclaiming instinct without guilt, power without cruelty, clarity without coldness. You stop trying to be endlessly good and instead you become whole. Eckhart Tolle would call this a dissolution of the pain body, that emotional residue feeding on the past. Every argument, every silent treatment, every manipulation triggers old wounds you thought were gone. But as you observe those reactions with awareness, without trying to fix or justify them, you begin to reclaim your energy. You realize that emotional pain isn't always punishment, it's information. Each time the narcissist provokes you, they unknowingly highlight the exact part of you that still believes love must be earned. Philosophers have always spoken of awakening as an act of destruction, the collapse of illusions. Socrates called it midwifing the soul, guiding it out of ignorance. In modern psychology, this is the cognitive awakening, when the fog of denial lifts and your brain begins to rewire. Studies on trauma recovery show that naming manipulation actually reduces its emotional grip. When you label the behavior, gaslighting, triangulation, projection, your prefrontal cortex reactivates, logic returns, and the spell begins to break. Awareness is the antidote. But awakening isn't peaceful at first. It's violent. It's the shattering of every illusion you built around love and loyalty. You grieve not only the narcissist, but also the version of yourself who kept believing in them. Nietzsche wrote that one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos, the sleepless nights, the endless analysis, the tears, becomes the fire that burns away naivety. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You see that real connection doesn't drain you. It nourishes you. For many, this stage feels lonely. You've detached from the narcissist's control, but you haven't yet rebuilt your identity. This in-between space is where transformation happens. Philosophers call it the void. Psychologists call it The neutral zone. It's the silence between endings and beginnings. If you can stay there, without rushing back to old patterns, clarity emerges. You begin to sense your own presence again, the part of you that existed before the manipulation began. And here's the paradox. Once you recognize manipulation, you don't just escape it, you evolve beyond it. You stop reacting to provocations, not out of fear, but out of understanding. You no longer need to prove your worth to someone incapable of seeing it. This awareness rewires your entire emotional system. You stop seeking external validation and start sourcing power internally. You move from victim to observer, from confusion to comprehension. Descartes once said that doubt is the origin of wisdom. When you doubt the narcissist's version of reality, you reclaim your truth. When you doubt their apologies, their false promises, their selective empathy, you stop being controlled by them. And when you doubt your own guilt, that constant feeling of not being enough, you start to heal, because guilt is the residue of their control, and letting it go is your first act of freedom. This awakening doesn't make you cynical. It makes you conscious. You see manipulation not as a tragedy, but as a revelation. It teaches you to discern energy, to listen to tone over words, to trust silence over charm. You begin to see human behavior through the lens of awareness rather than emotion. Jung called this seeing through the game. It's the ability to observe without identifying, to love without losing yourself. And then something extraordinary happens. You start feeling gratitude, not for the pain, but for the wisdom it gave you. You realize that every wound taught you to recognize sincerity, every betrayal taught you discernment, and every manipulation brought you closer to your authentic self. Eckhart Tolle said, "Life will give you whatever experience is most helpful for the evolution of your consciousness." The narcissist was not a curse, they were a catalyst. In this light, manipulation becomes the mirror that pushed you towards self-knowledge. It forced you to stop looking outward for peace and start building it from within. That's the essence of awakening. Not a soft enlightenment, but a fierce reclaiming of your own mind. You no longer see empathy as weakness or boundaries as cruelty. You understand that real compassion requires consciousness, and that consciousness is the one thing no manipulator can ever steal from you. At some point, the storm ends. Not because the narcissist stops attacking or because they finally change, but because you stop responding. Silence becomes strength. Distance becomes wisdom. What once felt like abandonment now feels like freedom. This is detachment, not in the cold spiritual sense of withdrawal, but in the powerful psychological act of reclaiming your own energy. You're no longer a reflection in someone else's distorted mirror. You've become whole again. Carl Jung described individuation as becoming who you truly are by separating from what you are not. For those who've survived narcissistic manipulation, that separation is not just metaphorical. It's cellular. Your nervous system learns to calm itself without waiting for someone else's approval. Your brain, once rewired by trauma, begins to create new connections through self-trust and self-soothing. Neuroscience confirms this. When you consistently choose peace over chaos, your brain's fear circuits deactivate, and regions tied to self-awareness and decision-making grow stronger. Healing is not an abstract idea. It's measurable, biological freedom. Detachment, contrary to popular belief, doesn't mean indifference. Eckhart Tolle defines it as non-dependence on external conditions for your inner state. It means you can see manipulation, arrogance, or cruelty and remain unshaken. Your emotions no longer rise and fall with their moods. The narcissist loses control because the lever they once pulled no longer works. You've unplugged from the system. Freud wrote that the true measure of maturity is the ability to love and to work. After a narcissistic entanglement, both are redefined. Love no longer means losing yourself for connection. Work no longer means proving your worth. You begin to operate from authenticity rather than performance. You stop trying to be liked and start being real. It's a quiet power, not the loud triumph of revenge, but the serene confidence of someone who no longer needs validation. This stage of healing often surprises people. They expect anger or bitterness, but what emerges is neutrality. You don't hate them, you just see them. The illusion has dissolved. Nietzsche once said, The man who has overcome himself has conquered the world. Overcoming the narcissist isn't about defeating them. It's about transcending the part of you that once needed their approval. You've shifted from external control to internal command. That's the deepest form of freedom. In therapy, this transformation is called post-traumatic growth. It's the phenomenon where people not only recover from pain, but evolve because of it. Studies show that individuals who process emotional trauma consciously often develop greater empathy, resilience, and clarity. They become more discerning, less reactive, and deeply connected to purpose. The scars don't vanish. They become symbols of wisdom. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Detachment is that realization in motion. It's no longer needing closure from those who can't give it. It's understanding that your healing doesn't depend on their apology. You stop chasing explanations and start embodying understanding. You no longer need to convince anyone of your value. You live it quietly. You also begin to recognize freedom not as isolation but as alignment. Your solitude feels sacred, not empty. You rediscover the things that nourish your mind. Books, art, nature, silence. These become your new mirrors. Instead of reflecting confusion, they reflect depth. And slowly, the internal dialogue changes. The voice that once whispered, "You're not enough," becomes one that says, "You're safe now." Descartes said that to live without philosophy is to drift. To live after narcissistic abuse without reflection is to repeat. That's why awareness must become your daily practice, not paranoia, but presence. You stay alert not to avoid pain, but to protect peace. You begin to sense emotional manipulation the way a sailor senses a coming storm. Not with fear, but with readiness. You steer your ship differently now. Perhaps the greatest revelation comes when you realize that detachment isn't the end of empathy. It's its evolution. You don't stop caring. You start caring consciously. You can love people without losing yourself in them. You can understand pain without absorbing it. This is emotional mastery, what philosophers and psychologists alike called equanimity. Jung saw it as the integration of light and shadow. The narcissist showed you the shadow, but now you've claimed the light. Freedom, at this point, isn't loud or dramatic. It's found in quiet mornings, where your thoughts are finally your own. It's in saying no without shaking. It's in loving without needing to fix. It's in walking away from manipulation, not with anger, but with peace. You see the game for what it was, but you no longer need to play it. And maybe, just maybe, you start to feel gratitude, not for the narcissist, but for the awakening they triggered. They taught you boundaries through pain, awareness through confusion, strength through loss. What they took from you forced you to rebuild what cannot be taken, your essence, your selfhood. In the end, detachment is not about losing love. It's about learning the highest form of it, the kind that begins within. And as you stand there, no longer trapped in their reflection, you realize something profound. They never truly knew you. They only saw the reflection of what they could use, but you finally see yourself not as broken or naive, but as awake, sovereign, and free.